Okay, today's lecture is going to be about 1 Corinthians. Let's begin talking about the authorship. The practically undisputed author of 1 Corinthians is the Apostle Paul. Of all Paul's letters, this one holds the earliest external testimony for Paul's authorship. In AD 95, still in the first century, Clement of Rome wrote to the Corinthians from the church in Rome. He quoted this epistle and its exhortation regarding the division they suffered, mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1:10 through 4:21. Sadly, it seems that the condition remained in Clement's day. The life of Paul is very well known. His contact with the city of Corinth took place on his second missionary journey. Paul worked very hard to share the gospel in Corinth. He worked diligently with Aquila and Priscilla during the week, and every Saturday he was in the synagogue preaching. When they arrived in Corinth, Silas and Timothy helped him. Jewish opposition finally forced Paul out of the synagogue, but they continued his ministry with the Gentiles and had greater success at that point. It seems the church was made up of all kinds of people, with few socially prominent people, save perhaps Sosthenes and Erastus. It appears that some of the believers came out of a strong slavery to sin. Jewish opposition continued until Paul was taken before the proconsul Gallio, who left him free to continue his ministry. After 18 months in Corinth, Paul felt God led him to move on. He returned to Jerusalem, then to Antioch, and after visiting the churches in Galatia, he crossed Asia Minor and settled in Ephesus. There, after being rejected in the Jewish synagogue, he opened a seminary of sorts where he taught daily. He stayed in Ephesus for more than 2 years. During this time, Apollos was ministering in Corinth. Paul kept in touch with the church, likely through Apollos and Sosthenes. Given his relationship as church founder, he was often consulted with questions. The family of Chloe told him about divisions in the church. He mentions this in 1 Corinthians 1:11. And the church sent a letter to Ephesus with several questions that Paul begins to answer in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. These two sources of information are the sparks that ignite the writing of the letter. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul mentions a previous letter in which he has warned them not to fraternize with supposed believers who live immorally. Innocently, or perhaps deliberately, it seems the Corinthians have misinterpreted Paul's instructions. Paul corrects this problem. Perhaps the previous letter was not kept because this one covers the subject of the first one in greater detail. What about provenance? Where was Paul when he wrote the letter? The final chapters of this letter show us that Paul is in Ephesus in the middle of a very difficult work. This would place Paul on his third missionary journey around AD 55. It has been 3 or 4 years since Paul was living in Corinth. Let's talk about the recipients who's the letter addressed to. It seems that the Corinthians were not generally a church of the rich and powerful, according to Paul's comments in 1 Corinthians 1:26. Although there are exceptions, Sosthenes and Erastus were clearly upper class. The nature of the city as a recognized center of pleasure and fun ensures that in the church there was a constant battle for holiness in sexuality and behavior in general. The Greeks loved pleasure, and the Corinthians did this with abandon. The church gives evidence of the Corinthians' superficial love for philosophy. One of the problems Paul faces in this letter from chapter 1 to chapter 4 is the attempt to turn the gospel into another school of philosophy with its teachers and thinkers vying for proselytes. It seems that some had chosen Apollos, others Paul, and others Peter, who had never visited the city probably, and placed them on pedestals. Each one tried to extol his teacher and discredit the others because, in a way, they went up or down with their school of thought leader. A spiritual, inflated pride had crept into the church that Paul mercilessly deflates. They claim to know everything, to be understood, rich, conquerors, and possessors of all the glory of the gospel. Paul reminds them of the harsh reality he faces as an apostle, with his own many sufferings and ministry to try to bring them back to earth. We have not yet been glorified. In general, This could be any church in the modern first world context. Jealousy, strife, foolish pride, tolerance of immorality, passivity, selfishness, attention-seeking, poor organization, sensuality, the law of conceited knowledge, and the absence of true uplifting love are all symptoms of basic spiritual problems that many churches continue to face to one degree or another. In some ways, the Corinthian letters read as the most immediately applicable to modern audiences in the developed world. The Christian church held great potential, located at a cultural crossroads and with a very large reach. Despite the immaturity and youth of the church, it was less than 5 years old, God had poured out great gifts on them. As for knowledge and spiritual gifts, Paul says that they lack nothing, 1 Corinthians 1, 5 through 7. The necessary material was there. The only thing that prevented this church from fulfilling its potential was its superficiality, its lack of a deep and mature knowledge of God that results in a walk governed by God's immeasurable love. It is no accident that this letter contains the highest words we find in the entire Bible about love. A behavior dictated by love is what they lacked. The sad thing is how easily we continue today to identify with their failings. The date of the letter. The final chapters of this letter show us that Paul is in the middle of a very hard work in Ephesus. This best fits Paul's extended stay in Ephesus mentioned in the book of Acts, giving us a date of writing of about AD 55. I'd like to mention some things about the geography and culture because it's really important when we try to understand Corinth. Corinth was a very important city in the first century. Even a quick glance at a map makes it obvious that the city was placed in a privileged position geographically, commanding undeniable advantages in commerce. Greece is divided in two main, roughly equal land bodies, one to the north and one to the south. These two large bodies are connected by a very narrow strip of land on its eastern side. Corinth was built on that strip of land. That meant that any land traffic between the northern portion and the southern portion, the Peloponnesian, of Greece was forced to go through Corinth. As if that weren't enough, Corinth had two ports, one on the west bank and one on the east. The waters south of Greece are dangerous, and many boats in Paul's day preferred to dock in Corinth, unload their cargo, allow it to be carried across the city, and then load it on a boat on the opposite dock. Thus, the cargo could be transferred and the treacherous waters south of Greece could be avoided. There was even a road built between the two ports, and the smaller boats could be hoisted out of the water at one port, carried across the city, and set afloat on the opposite dock. Larger ships that could not be moved in this manner would often winter in Corinth to avoid the most dangerous time of year in those waters. So all of that meant that in terms of maritime trade, Corinth enjoyed a lot of commerce. The Romans destroyed the Greek city of Corinth in 146 BC for its participation in a rebellion. But Julius Caesar, recognizing its geographic importance, rebuilt it in 46 BC as a Roman colony, peopled by a great number of freed slaves or freedmen. He made it the capital of Greece, a region that the Romans called Achaia. Athens remained the cultural capital a bit to the east of Corinth, and she enjoyed a special status as a free city, being the center of Greek thought. But politically, economically, and strategically, Corinth was the true capital. Despite its beginning as a Roman colony, by the time of Paul, the city was inhabited mainly by Greeks. The city considered itself Greek, and they felt proud of their heritage. They had a great love of knowledge, though there were no prominent philosophers in Corinth. Perhaps a city that lives and breathes commerce in all it does is not the best place for great intellectual considerations. Even so, they did love wisdom, and they shared the characteristic Greek curiosity and their love for the great teachers and philosophical schools. Corinth's geographical and political situation made it one of the richest cities of its time. As always happens when there is much money, there was a strong industry secondary to commerce which devoted itself to the entertainment of the wealthy. People went to Corinth to have a good time. Basically, Corinth was the Las Vegas of the ancient world. It was a city given over to pleasure that loved superficial philosophical discussions. It was a supremely comfortable and self-complacent city. The hedonism of the Corinthians was notorious, to the point that the word to Corinthianize someone, they kind of invented the verb, they used it to describe the practice of immorality. And the phrase Corinthian girl meant prostitute. The city was given to vice, to entertainment, and to pleasure. They even had their own stadium where they held athletic tournaments which were second in popularity only to the Olympic Games themselves. Jews, with their interest in commerce and banking, could scarcely be absent from a city like Corinth. There was at least one Jewish synagogue, probably more than one. These Jews could be just as ardent in their defense of the Jewish traditions and religion as any other Jewish colony, though there seemed to be evidences of a certain negative influence with regards to morality and Jewish religion in Corinth. When this letter was written, Jews in general were not well liked, since Emperor Caligula had just expelled them all from Rome in AD 49, about a year before Paul arrived in the city to proclaim the gospel. This expulsion was the reason Aquila and Priscilla were in Corinth when Paul arrived there. We read that in Acts 18:2. Despite this, Jews were so useful in their financial labors that it was not long before they were reintroduced in the great cities, even back in Rome. This time in which there was a certain lack of prestige afforded to the Jews coincided with the establishment of the church in Corinth, and God used this situation to protect the church from Jewish opposition while she was in her infancy. Thus, when the Jews appealed before the proconsul Gallio to take action against Paul, he dismissed them with disdain, not wishing to be bothered by Jewish religious disputes. Because of this, Paul was able to stay 18 months in Corinth. This seems to have been the only city in which Paul was allowed to preach without opposition. He left when the Lord showed him it was time, and he did not have to flee to save his life, as had so often been the case in other cities. So what's the situation that gave rise to the writing of this letter? As we've said, Paul was working hard at Ephesus, working in the morning, making tents, renting a reading room where he met in the evenings to teach the gospel and to train leaders and send them out. When he received the news from Corinth while he was there that required his response, he couldn't abandon everything and run to Corinth, but he wrote a long and effective letter to exhort, encourage, rebuke, punish, and exalt. After his departure from Corinth, other leaders had come and gone. Apollos had been sent to Corinth from Ephesus by Priscilla and Aquila. We read of this in Acts 18:24 through 28. It may be that Peter had some contact with the church. Paul is going to mention a faction in the church that claims him as their leader, 1 Corinthians 1:12. Interestingly, they don't use the name Peter. They claim to belong to Cephas, which might point to a very Hebraist group, a group that doesn't even want to use the Greek name, but the Aramaic Cephas stone or rock. The situation in Corinth was unique among all the churches in which Paul had served. In every other context, the churches he had started faced fierce opposition, either from strong Jewish colonies, as in the churches of Macedonia, or from representatives of the pagan cult, as in Ephesus. In Corinth, however, from the very beginning of Paul's ministry there, the complaint brought against the Christians by the Jews was summarily dismissed by the proconsul Gallio. We read of this in Acts 18:12 through 17. As a result, it appears that the only church planted by Paul that was not facing intense pressures from the surrounding culture was the church in Corinth. The many internal problems the church faced were, at least in part, due to the ease they enjoyed. Without the external pressures to focus their attention and loyalty on Christ, complacency, bickering, sensuality, and competitive dynamics within the church crept in. And Perhaps that is the reason sometimes churches in developed nations today struggle with many of the similar problems that the Corinthians struggled with, because we too are in a context without persecution. Sometime during his stay in Ephesus, Paul sent a now lost letter to the church in Corinth. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, he references this previous letter in which he seems to have told the church not to associate with immoral people. His instructions were apparently expanded far beyond what he intended, and he feels the need to correct their understanding in his next letter, which is this letter we're talking about, 1 Corinthians. So there's a lost letter that preceded 1 Corinthians. After writing this first, now lost letter, Paul was visited by members of the Corinthian church while in Ephesus. People from Chloe told him that there were serious partisanships in the church. Some were competing against others. Some defended Apollos. Some defended Paul. Others defended Peter, or actually Cephas is how they chose to name it. And others, with this air of superiority, kind of the super spiritual ones among the group, called themselves those of Christ. It's interesting when Paul addresses them, he asks, is Christ divided? Is there a separate group belonging to Christ within the church? Anyway, Paul had heard that the Corinthians tolerated one claiming to be a believer who was cohabiting with his stepmother. Also, the church itself apparently had written a letter in which they asked about several important issues. And Paul apparently addresses these. And the formula he uses to introduce these topics is, now concerning, and he will insert like a quote from the letter he received from them, and then he will respond to that quote. And often the quote says something that Paul disagrees very strongly with. So be careful when you're reading 1 Corinthians that you identify those quotes that don't represent, like he says, for example, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. That's not something Paul says, but he immediately responds to that, and kind of offers a counterpoint. So apparently those are quotes from this lost letter that he received from the Corinthian church with questions. They're also asking if it's good or bad to marry. Christ is about to return. Should we bother with getting married? That kind of thing. Whether or not they should eat meat sacrificed to idols. You would think the Jerusalem Council settled that, but note that Paul never quotes the Jerusalem Council because he didn't agree with their limitation regarding meat sacrificed to idols. He had a much more nuanced understanding of the issue, and he demonstrates that in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. Paul faced problems of confusion as to the responsibilities of a wife to her husband and a husband to his wife, and of both of them to God. He faced the problem of people who took advantage of the Lord's Supper to binge on food while they allowed others to go hungry. He needs to explain the correct functioning of gifts, all part of the same body, not competing with one another. He needed to encourage them to reach for the highest things, to pursue godly love. He faced a problem of abuse of the gift of tongues in worship and presented a defense of the resurrection of the dead. Paul writes to a church he had founded 3 or 4 years ago that is now in need of help for its many and complex problems. Paul writes a long letter with no easy answers. A good example of this is the treatment he gives to the question of eating meat sacrificed to idols. He doesn't just say yes or no. He walks them through 3 chapters talking about all the implications of eating it and how it affects those who are watching and how people interpret the fact that you're eating this meat. And all of this plays into the question of whether or not you should eat it. So what's the purpose then? What does Paul hope to accomplish by writing this letter? Paul writes this letter to apply general medicine to a body with many and diverse wounds. He wants this letter to cause the church to be unified, for them to abandon partisanship. He wants them to truly love each other. Paul wants them to walk in a spiritual manner, not a merely human or physical one. He wants to get them to give up immorality, to be truly holy. He challenges them to a more complex understanding of the dilemmas they face, to learn the example of Christ, that of service at the expense of personal rights. Faced with the various problems of the Corinthians, Paul applies ointment here, surgery there, cutting and healing, shaming and praising, condemning and exalting as each problem requires. The end of the letter is clear. Paul wants this church of such high potential to be a strong and mature church, a clear example of the Lord they represent, united by a true love that exposes the falsehood of what the priestesses of Aphrodite dare to call love. He wants to eliminate among them the childish pride that leads them to compete, to spoil worship by seeking attention and abusing the gifts of God. He calls them to a serene, humble, servant, loving walk. And there's one last thing I would like to comment about 1 Corinthians, and it's the idea of Paul's use of this terminology of flesh and spirit. When I'm translating Paul, anytime he uses those two terms, I always capitalize spirit, and let me explain why I do that. One of Paul's favorite dichotomies is flesh versus spirit. How we view this is an important part of understanding Paul's view of Christian morality. It is unfortunate that Paul's thought has often been viewed through a Platonic lens that interprets both terms more as a dualism than a dichotomy. And the difference between those two words, where a dualism can refer to two parts of a whole, whereas a dichotomy refers to two things that are opposite and incompatible. They are kind of mutually exclusive. If Paul is read in light of Plato, he is differentiating the material aspect from the spiritual aspect in a Christian. So they're both happening at the same time. They're both concurrent. So we're looking more at an idea of dualism, right? Flesh then refers to the material body and is associated with the impulses and appetites of the body, sexual desire, gluttony, alcoholism, and other addictions. Spirit then refers to the immaterial aspects in a person, thoughts, emotions, volition, the impulse to seek and know God. In the teaching of many, Plato's negative view of the body is what we should think when we read Paul's words about the flesh. Our bodies crave things that they should not. We must allow our minds and souls, regenerated by Christ, to guide us rather than these evil, unglorified bodies. But did Paul believe that the body is innately evil and the spirit innately good? I don't think so. Perhaps in an attempt to avoid Platonic dualism, bodies are evil, spirits are innately good, we end up with the unhelpful and highly interpretive translations that substitute sinful nature where Paul has flesh. Yeah, we avoid the denigration of the physical body and the idea that spirits are untainted by sin, but we're left with the impression that people have two natures at war within, one redeemed nature in Christ and an old unredeemed nature that still remains even after saving faith has taken place. This gets us closer to Paul's intent, but I believe it still falls short of what he's actually talking about. Differentiations between our physical and our non-physical aspects are legitimate to a certain degree, and we can all attest to the continued presence of patterns of living we knew before coming to faith. However, I believe both of these approaches completely miss the point Paul is trying to make when he uses the terms flesh and spirit. 1 Corinthians provides the clearest picture of how Paul uses these terms that surface throughout all of his letters. In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul laments that he cannot address his readers in Corinth as spirituals, pneumatikos, but as fleshlies, sarkikois, or sarkikois. I'm sorry, I'm not reading right. sarkinos, sorry. Flesh is sarx, and pneuma is spirit. In the Greek, there are no nouns here, only plural adjectives functioning nominally. The force of this usage is spiritual persons versus fleshly persons. The noun is kind of implied in the adjective in the plural. So these are the terms he's using. I can't address you as spiritual persons. I have to address you as fleshly persons. What are the evidences that they are fleshly persons? Paul lays out the evidence. There is jealousy and strife among you. That's in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 3. What he says next is crucial to understanding Paul's thinking. Let me just read it. Insofar as there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not fleshly people, and are you not walking according to humankind? For when one is saying, I am Paul's, and another, I am Apollos's, are you not mere men? That's 1 Corinthians 3, verses 3 and 4. A couple of observations I want to make about the wording there. First, we can observe that the things Paul points to as evidence of the flesh have nothing to do with physical appetites. He says nothing of sexual immorality, which was a problem in Corinth, and he will address it. He doesn't talk about gluttony, also a problem he talks about in chapter 11. He speaks of ills of the mind and spirit, jealousy and strife. These impulses are not driven by the physical body. They stem from ailments of the mind and soul, the non-physical parts of us. The second thing I'd like to point out about this, note how Paul describes the tragedy of living in the flesh. They are walking according to humankind. Kata anthropon peripatete. Literally, walking according to man. So long as they are claiming Apollos or Paul, they are just men. For Paul, flesh became a shorthand for everything that a human is on his own apart from God. The tragedy for a Christian living in the flesh is that they are reverting to the status of mere humans, as though God were not a part of their lives, as though Christ had not claimed them, created them anew, filled them with his Spirit. The problem Paul addresses when he uses the term flesh is not limited to physical appetites. He is describing everything we are and every capability we bring to the table, physical, mental, emotional, volitional, spiritual, in isolation from God. Flesh is what we are on our own. The danger against which Paul warns over and over in his letters is that we reduce ourselves to living the way we once did, as though it were just me walking this earth alone, as though it all depended on me, as though God were not a part of my life. It is very clear in Paul's letters that we can choose to live as though Christ were not part of our lives, as though we were navigating life on our own, only checking in with God in moments of crisis, but otherwise charting our own path, pursuing our own plans and agendas. Paul considers such a life to be tragic. On the other end of the spectrum for Paul lies a life in the Spirit. This should always be capitalized. Paul is not speaking of prioritizing the immaterial aspects of life over the physical ones. He is speaking of a life lived in God's Spirit or on our own. So Spirit to Paul there means the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, not your spirit. The terms in Christ and Christ in me are crucial to Paul's understanding of the Christian walk. There is to be a mutuality between us and Christ. We abide in him. He abides in us. We do not merely consult him now and then. We are immersed in him and he in us. To walk in the Spirit, then, is not simply to prioritize things like prayer and scripture reading, things that are mental or spiritual. It is to consciously live in communion with the Spirit of God, with Christ, surrendered to his will in an uninterrupted conversation and consultation. This is why the flesh-spirit divide in Paul is mutually exclusive. These are not two realities present in our lives at the same time, two natures at war within. They are two orientations of the heart that are mutually exclusive. Either we are oriented inward toward ourselves, living in the flesh, or we are oriented heavenward toward Christ, living in the Spirit. We cannot do both at the same time. Rather than thinking of warring natures, we should think of it as our journey in life. Are we moving north or south? Are we walking heavenward or hellward? Are we in ourselves or are we in the Spirit? Okay, and this concludes the lecture on 1 Corinthians.